Imagine if we could edit our own DNA, like the fundamental code, not just for medicine now, but changing things in an embryo that get passed down generation after generation.
Yeah, it sounds like pure science fiction, doesn't it?
Almost. Maybe like something you'd see in, well, maybe even a story coming out soon. But it's moving really fast into actual scientific possibility.
And that speed, it forces these incredibly tough questions on us, As the tech leaps forward, how does our conversation about what we can do and what we should do even keep up?
Exactly. That tension, that's right at the heart of what we look at here. Technology, policy, our lives, all tangled up and reshaping each other. And right now, you can really feel a shift happening around a topic that, frankly, has been pretty taboo for a few years.
Yeah.
Gene editing human embryos.
Yeah, it definitely feels like the lid is coming off that conversation again.
It does. And it seems like interest from, say, the tech world, from venture capital, is part of what's stirring the pot. It's one of those moments, isn't it? Science moving, money noticing, and suddenly everyone has to pay attention.
It really is.
Yeah.
And you see it bubbling up everywhere, scientific papers, ethical debates, and even creative projects exploring the what-ifs. It just shows how much the ground is shifting.
So for this deep dive, our mission is really to, well, unpack where things stand now. What's the science actually look like? What are the ethical knots, the rules or lack of rules, and why now? Why does this feel like a conversation we need to have right now?
Okay, let's do it.
All right, so that shift. There's been a pretty clear signal, especially from the tech investment side, that something's different. We're hearing about, prominent investors actively looking for scientists, engineers.
Right, people in gene editing, computational biology, AI, machine learning.
Yeah, exactly. Folks who are specifically interested in working on editing embryos.
And the stated aim, at least publicly, is often framed around funding, say, a U.S. company to tackle serious unmet medical needs.
Yeah.
Genetic diseases.
Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is that framing, that language hearing, things like the time is right for a defining company in this area.
Yeah, pointing to the, hundreds of millions affected by genetic conditions globally and the potential for a huge impact on human health. It's bold language.
It really is. And it feels like such a change from the very recent past. You just can't talk about this without remembering the huge shadow cast by what happened back in 2018.
Oh, absolutely not. That news out of China that genetically edited babies had actually been born,
Right.
It sent, absolute shockwaves around the world, scientifically, ethically, everywhere.
The fallout was massive. The scientist involved, he ended up with a 3-year prison sentence, didn't he, for illegal medical practices?
That's right. And the findings were stark forging ethical review documents and, crucially, misleading the doctors and the patients involved. They didn't even know they were implanting gene-edited embryos.
Wow. And the reaction from scientists, ethicists, it was pretty much universal condemnation.
Completely. Just wall-to-wall condemnation. The consensus was that the experiment was wildly premature, ethically unjustifiable, and frankly, scientifically irresponsible.
It wasn't just about the tech not being ready.
No, not entirely. It was also about need. There were already safer ways to prevent HIV transmission, which was the stated goal. So why take these unknown risks with the babies? Risks from the editing itself, things we couldn't predict.
Yeah, it just seemed to slam the brakes on the whole field of heritable editing, didn't it? Led to immediate calls for, global moratoria.
Definitely. A hard pause in any clinical use. It was a stark reminder of the dangers of, letting the technology race ahead of the safety checks, the ethical frameworks, the governance.
So, okay, big controversy, lots of caution. But the lab research, the basic science, it didn't just stop dead, did it? What's been happening on the technical side since then?
No, it didn't stop entirely. Basic research, often in university labs, maybe with less funding than VC might bring, but it kept pushing the tools forward.
And the original tools, like the first CRISPR-Cas9 system, revolutionary, sure, but they had their issues, especially for something as delicate as an embryo, right?
Exactly. Original CRISPR, it works by basically cutting both strands of the DNA, like snipping a rope. Powerful, yes, but that cut, it could lead to problems.
Why? What kind of problems?
Well, when the cell repairs that double cut, it can sometimes insert or delete bits of DNA. By mistake, we call those indels. Big ones, small ones, unpredictable. You could also get mosaicism.
Mosaicism, meaning?
Meaning not all the cells in the early embryo get edited correctly or they get edited differently, so you end up with a mix of edited and unedited cells. And sometimes, even worse, big chunks of chromosomes could get lost. Powerful, but messy.
Okay, so clearly needed refinement. have newer techniques come along.
Yes, and that's a big part of why the conversation is maybe shifting again. We now have things like base editing and prime editing.
Base editing and prime editing, how are they different?
They're designed for more precision. Think of base editing like a pencil with an eraser for DNA letters. It can chemically change one DNA base letter to another, like swapping an A for a G or a C for a T, often without making that double strand cut at all.
Ah, okay, so no big snip, just a direct change.
Generally, yes. And prime editing is maybe even more versatile. It can also make single-letter changes, but potentially also small, precise insertions or deletions, again, aiming to avoid that risky double-strand break. The goal is much higher fidelity, fewer unwanted side effects.
So trying to fix the main problems of the older CRISPR method, fewer big errors.
They definitely show promise there.
Yeah.
Studies are showing fewer of those messy indels right at the target site, which is good. And this is really important, but they aren't perfect either.
Still challenges then.
Oh, yes. Mosaicism can still be an issue. You can also get bystander edits, small unintended changes happening near your target site that you didn't want. And while it's less common than with the old CRISPR, unwanted indels can still pop up sometimes.
So better precision, definitely an improvement, but still kinks to iron out. Significant kinks.
Absolutely. The broad consensus among scientists working directly in this area is pretty clear. Even with these newer, more precise tools, the technology is not yet optimized. It's not proven safe enough for any kind of routine clinical use in human embryos.
Not ready for prime time.
Nowhere near. There's still a huge amount of basic research needed to really nail down the safety, the precision, the long-term effects, the efficiency. The gap between what we can do in a dish and what would be safe and effective in creating a person is still vast.
Okay, that's a crucial reality check on the science. So powerful tools, getting better, but still facing real technical hurdles. Let's pivot to the why, the potential uses, because this is where the ethics get really intense. What are the medical applications people talk about?
Well, the main one you always hear is preventing severe monogenic diseases.
Monogenic, meaning caused by one gene.
Exactly. Single gene disorders. Things like cystic fibrosis, sickle cell anemia, Huntington's disease, devastating conditions. The idea, the hope, is you could correct that specific faulty gene in the embryo right at the start, and the child would never develop the disease.
Which sounds incredible, right? Tackling these awful diseases at the source.
Right.
But is editing the embryo the only way to avoid passing those on?
And that's a critical question, a really critical point in this whole debate. For many of these single gene conditions, we already have other options. Maybe not simple options, but options.
Like IVF.
Exactly. IVF combined with something called PGT, pre-implantation genetic testing. Parents who know they carry a risk can create embryos through IVF, test those embryos for the specific genetic mutation before pregnancy.
And then choose to implant only the embryos that don't have the mutation.
Precisely. So for many couples facing these risks, there's already a path to having a healthy child who's genetically related to them without ever needing to edit an embryo's genes.
So that suggests the actual group of people for whom embryo editing is the only way to have a healthy related child. That group might be quite small.
It might be much narrower than you'd initially think. And that perceived narrowness of the purely therapeutic need, that's partly why the discussion so quickly slides into much more controversial territory.
Which is enhancement.
Enhancement, yeah.
Yeah.
If you can fix a gene for cystic fibrosis, well, could you tweak genes to maybe lower the risk of heart disease later in life? Or Alzheimer's? Or the really charged one, could you try to enhance traits? Like intelligence.
And that feels like a completely different ballgame, ethically.
It absolutely is. The intent changes. Fixing a known severe disease is one thing. Trying to go beyond typical health, trying to add advantages, even just disease resistance, is fundamentally different.
And crucially, unlike editing, say, lung cells in an adult with CF, edits made to an embryo get passed down forever.
That's the core issue, heritability. These changes don't stop with the individual. They enter the human gene pool. And that immediately brings up huge red flags.
Like eugenics.
Concerns about eugenics, yes. About potentially selecting or engineering preferred traits. It also raises serious worries about inequality. Imagine a future where only the wealthy can afford genetic upgrades. You could create huge societal divides.
A genetic class system.
Potentially. And maybe the biggest issue is we just don't understand genes well enough. They interact in incredibly complex ways. Making intentional changes for enhancement could have totally unforeseen negative consequences down the line for individuals and for our species. We'd be tinkering with the code of humanity without a full instruction manual.
It's really no surprise, then, that those calls for moratoria specifically mention enhancement and those unknown long-term effects as huge worries.
Absolutely. That line between therapy and enhancement. It's blurry, it's hard to define, and it's incredibly dangerous to cross lightly, if at all. It really forces us to ask fundamental questions about what health is, what normal is, and what kind of future we want.
Okay, so we've got this advancing science, these really deep ethical divides. What about the rules? What does the regulatory landscape actually look like? Is anyone in charge globally?
Not really, not in a unified way. Right now, using this clinically actually making babies from edited embryos is effectively banned or heavily restricted in many, many countries,
Including the U.S.?
including the U.S. There's a specific law, a congressional rider, that blocks the FDA from even looking at applications for clinical trials that involve editing the human germline in a way that could be inherited. Plus, federal money can't be used for research that creates or destroys human embryos.
So pretty strong roadblocks for actually doing it clinically in the U.S.
For now, yes.
Yeah.
Though research on embryos, maybe using private funds, that can still happen in some places. But globally, it's a patchwork. Trying to get a binding international treaty, what you might call hard law, seems really unlikely. Countries just have very different ethical views, different legal systems.
So instead of hard laws, what governs it?
It's more reliant on what's called soft law. Think international guidelines, recommendations from bodies like the World Health Organization, standards set by scientific and medical professional groups, and, importantly, ongoing public debate.
So less like strict rules, more like shared understandings and peer pressure. And probably not always consistent.
Exactly. It's much fuzzier. And you see that reflected in conflicting reports sometimes about what different countries are thinking or planning. There's no single, harmonized global rulebook. It's very much evolving.
And public opinion must play a huge role in shaping that soft law environment.
A massive role.
Yeah.
Ultimately, what society finds acceptable or unacceptable puts enormous pressure on scientists, funders, and regulators.
And the poll suggests the public isn't just giving a blanket yes or no, right? There's nuance.
Definitely nuance. Consistently, surveys show a real difference depending on why you'd edit. For instance, Pew Research found a solid majority of U.S. adults think it's okay to edit a baby's genes if the goal is treating a serious disease they'd be born with.
So the therapeutic angle gets some support.
Yes, when it's framed as preventing known severe suffering. But that support just plummets when you ask about enhancement.
Like making a baby smarter.
Exactly. Huge opposition to that. Those people in those polls saw using the tech to try and boost intelligence as taking medical technology too far. It suggests the public might accept it for clear, serious medical needs, but draws a pretty firm line at enhancement.
Okay, so let's bring it back to where we started. This renewed interest from tech, from venture capital. How does that injection of energy and money fit into this picture? With the science still developing, the ethics debated, the public wary.
It's a really interesting dynamic, actually. You hear some researchers, some ethicists even, saying, well, maybe this isn't entirely a bad thing.
How so?
The argument goes something like this. If the science is moving forward, if this technology does have potential, maybe it's better for the serious work, the safety testing, the ethical grappling, to happen out in the open, with proper funding, by reputable groups, under scrutiny.
Rather than being driven underground by strict bans.
That's the fear some express, that overly strict bans could just push it into the shadows where oversight is impossible. So the argument is maybe well-funded, transparent efforts are the most responsible way to rigorously figure out if this can ever be done safely and ethically, and if so, how.
And the investment itself, it's a signal, isn't it? A signal that some people with resources think the science or the potential market is getting real enough to bet on, despite all the controversy.
It absolutely sends that signal, and that increased visibility, that potential influx of serious funding and talent. It kind of forces the public conversation, makes it harder to ignore. Society has to engage more actively now with where these lines should be drawn as the science creeps closer.
Yeah, it feels less hypothetical now.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Real money and real scientific momentum are pushing the dialogue forward.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've seen the incredible potential preventing awful genetic diseases. But weighed against that, you've got these major safety questions still hanging over the technology, profound ethical worries about enhancement, about heritability, and this huge challenge of building governance that can actually keep up.
It really is a complex balance,
Yeah.
and it makes you think about the history of other technologies, like IVF, right?
How so?
Well, IVF was hugely controversial when it first started. Lots of ethical objections, skepticism. But over decades, with scientific progress, clinical success stories, and ongoing public discussion, it became, a pretty standard, accepted medical procedure. Millions of babies born. So the question lingers, could germline editing follow a path like that? Or are the issues here just fundamentally different, more profound?
That really is the crux of it, isn't it? As we get this, frankly, almost godlike power to potentially rewrite the human blueprint before birth, how do you, listening right now, think about that balance? Where is the line between using this power to stop suffering from terrible diseases and the deep generational implications of tinkering with what makes us human? How does society figure out what's okay and what's just taking things too far?